In 1879, a young widow named Sharon hauled 80 discarded railroad ties home alone while the entire village laughed. Not one hand offered help. But Sharon wasn't building a fence, she was building a fortress. When the great storm slammed the valley, tearing trees from the soil and crushing every ordinary cabin flat, her tie wall bunker stood untouched even as a full-grown pine crashed onto its roof. The blizzard didn't break her. It made the railroad sit up and take notice. What did they do next? The townsfolk called her a sideshow. Each railroad tie she dragged through the mud weighed nearly 200 pounds, solid oak soaked in creosote and years of grit, and she would never weigh much above 110 herself. No man in that valley offered a hand. The merchants simply closed their shutters a little tighter. The women whispered that grief had unhinged her. What none of them understood was that Sharon wasn't building a cabin to hide inside. She was building an answer to a storm they hadn't yet met, using the very thing the railroad left behind. And when the black clouds finally rolled over the ridge, the whole valley would realize they had ignored the only person who was truly ready. Granite Fork sat in a narrow mountain valley where the railroad had clawed its way through 3 years earlier, leaving behind a scar of iron and discard. The mining claims had already started failing by the time Sharon buried her husband Thomas. A blasting accident, the foreman had muttered, as though that explained losing a man of 26. The railroad company offered no pension to a grieving widow, only the right to stay on their claim long enough to starve. And that would have been the end of her story if she hadn't looked at the pile of old ties dumped beside the track. They were massive things. 8 feet long, 8 inches thick, solid oak soaked in creosote until the wood turned nearly black. The railroad was upgrading to new ties and leaving the old ones to rot. Sharon asked the section foreman if she could take them. He laughed so hard that the other workers turned to stare. Take as many as you can carry, he told her, certain she would manage maybe two. What he didn't understand was that Sharon no longer feared impossible weight. She had already carried grief that was heavier. She started the next morning. She rigged a crude harness from old rope and leather strapping, and she dragged the first tie behind her like a dead beast. It took her nearly 4 hours to haul it the half-mile from the track to her claim. By the time she arrived, her hands were bleeding through her gloves, and her dog Rusty, a caramel-colored stray she had found the same week Thomas died, was limping beside her. That tie alone weighed nearly twice her own body. The next day she did it again. Then again. The townsfolk thought she was not just crazy but dangerous. Men would stand outside the general store and watch her pass, her whole body straining forward, the tie scraping deep gouges into the frozen mud. Nobody ever stepped out to help her. Not once. Mineral Creek was the name of the settlement, and its people were hard, practical, superstitious about widows who refused to weep in public. Mrs. Harkness, the storekeeper's wife, told her husband that Sharon had a demon of pride inside her. The men around the stove nodded. Only one person ever asked her a direct question. His name was Finn McCready, a former timber cruiser who had spent 40 winters in these mountains. He had survived rock falls, cave-ins, and the great blizzard of 1865 that killed 12 people in one night. He was not the kind of man who wasted time on cruelty. One afternoon he stood in the mud at the edge of her claim while she wrestled a tie into place and asked quietly, "What are you building that needs a wall this thick?" Sharon looked at him through the hair that had come loose around her face. "I'm building something that won't fall down when the wind comes," she said. Finn said nothing for a long while. Then he turned and walked away. But that night he told a few men at the saloon that the widow was building a fortress made from the mistakes of the railroad. Someone asked if it would work. He didn't answer. By late October, the ties were stacked 3 high into a rectangle that looked less like a cabin and more like a primitive bunker. Sharon nested them horizontally, offsetting the joints so each corner interlocked, then pounded clay and gravel into the gaps. The walls were over 3 feet thick in places. She built a roof of lighter poles and tar paper, not nearly as strong as the walls, but she planned to load it with more ties if a storm came. The door was a heavy piece she salvaged from the mine, hung on iron hinges from 2 vertical ties she had buried deep in the ground. Every evening after the sun dropped behind the ridge, She would sit inside with Rusty, the creosote smell still sharp in the air, and she would feel something that had been missing since the day they told her Thomas was gone. She felt like the world was finally behind her on the outside, and she was in here. But the valley had other plans. In the first week of November, a hard rain came. Not snow yet, but a freezing downpour that lasted 30 hours and turned the ground into sliding muck. Sharon woke in the dark to a deep grinding sound that wasn't thunder. She ran outside with a lantern and found the south wall had settled 3 inches, throwing the entire corner out of alignment. A gap had opened near the foundation wide enough for a man's arm to pass through. The soil beneath that edge was softer than she had guessed, a seam of clay that had turned to grease under the water. The weight of the ties had done exactly what she hadn't prepared for. It had sunk. Finn McCready rode past the next morning and saw the damage instantly. He dismounted slowly, studied the lean of the corner, and gave a low grunt. "Ground's eating your wall," he said. "Any fool could have told you not to build a load like that without stone footings." Sharon stood in the cold, her coat soaked, her face blank. She had nothing to say. But then Finn pointed at the gap and added something worse. "Once the wind gets inside that opening, it won't just push. It'll peel the whole roof off like a lid." He mounted his horse, paused, and spoke over his shoulder. "I've seen men freeze in houses stronger than this one." That afternoon, Sharon began digging. She unstacked the entire south corner tie by tie alone, while the settlement watched from a safe distance. She dug down past the soft clay until she hit solid stone. Then she spent 4 days hauling heavy rocks from the creek bed and packing them into a crude foundation. She relayed the ties tighter, driving in a crossbrace of old railroad spikes she had scavenged from the tracks. Rusty never left her side. When she finally paused on the 5th day, the corner looked uglier than before, scarred and patched, but it no longer moved when she pushed against it. She had learned what the ground wanted. Now she had to face what the sky would bring. December arrived with a strange stillness. The old miners of Granite Fork noticed it first. The air would go dead for hours, no wind at all, the smoke from the chimneys rising straight up into a pearl-gray sky. Finn McCready himself grew quiet in a way that frightened people who knew him. He told the foreman at the railroad to double-lash the freight tarps before the end of the week. He told the storekeeper that anyone living in a canvas tent should move into town. When someone asked about the widow and her tie cabin, Finn said nothing. But late one afternoon, he walked out to her claim one last time. Sharon was on the roof, using a rope pulley to lift a heavy tie into position as a crossbeam. The dog was tense at the base, whining at the horizon. Finn stood below, his breath smoking. "There's a big one coming," he called up to her. "The kind that flattens everything that isn't anchored to the heart of the mountain." He offered her a cot in the mining office. She refused. Didn't argue. He just looked at the walls of dark, oily oak that surrounded her, walls heavy enough to stop a train. Then he turned to leave. As he went, he said one more thing that lodged itself in Sharon's chest like a splinter. "I hope you guessed right, girl, because when that wind hits, nobody will get to you in time." The morning of the 3rd of December, Rusty stopped eating. The birds disappeared. The sky turned the color of old iron, and Sharon felt the pressure drop so fast that her ears ached. She brought the last tie inside and barred the door. Then she listened. The silence outside was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the storm was gathering itself. And in that terrible quiet, Sharon sat with her back against the wall of oak and creosote, her fingers wrapped in Rusty's fur, and waited for a wind that had killed stronger men than any she had ever known. The storm did not announce itself with wind. It arrived as a sudden, suffocating weight, as though the entire atmosphere above Granite Fork had dropped by 1,000 feet and was now pressing down with intent to crush. Rusty whimpered low in his throat and pressed himself flat against the floorboards. Sharon felt the change inside her chest before she heard a single gust. Then the first scream came through the mountains. It was not a wind she recognized. This was a desert wind, a wind born far away on open plains where nothing broke its path for hundreds of miles, and it had gathered speed across that emptiness until it struck the ridge above Granite Fork like a fist. The cabin took the blow without flinching. The walls of creosote-soaked oak, 3 feet thick and braced with railroad spikes, did what Sharon had designed them to do. They refused to budge. But the sound was something else entirely. Outside, the forest began to die. She could hear it piece by piece, a sequence of violent cracks that came faster than gunshots. A lodgepole pine near the creek snapped at the trunk and went down with a tearing roar. Then another, closer, and then the sickening splinter of a spruce being twisted apart while still rooted. Sharon pressed her eye to a gap in the door frame and saw the world turning sideways. Snow had not yet fallen, but the wind carried a fog of pulverized ice crystals so dense that the air looked solid. Trees swayed at impossible angles, their branches streaming like hair in water. Rusty growled at the darkness. The sound brought Sharon back from the edge of panic. She remembered Thomas, how he used to say that fear was not the enemy but numbness. If you still felt afraid, you were still alive enough to act. So she acted. She unbarred the heavy door just long enough to grab the iron reinforcing bar she had left outside, then slammed it shut and dropped the crossbeam into its brackets. Her shoulders burned from the effort. The air around her was cold, but inside the walls the temperature had barely dropped. The ties, thick and dense, were holding more than just structure. They were holding warmth. And then came the sound that stopped her breath. A sustained, low-pitched groan that was different from the others. Deeper, older. It came from uphill, where a massive ponderosa pine had stood for maybe 2 centuries before anyone drew a map of this valley. Sharon had seen it 100 times, the monarch of the slope, its trunk as wide as a wagon. She had never thought to fear it because it had always seemed permanent. Now she understood nothing was permanent in a wind of this magnitude. The groan became a roar, and the roar became a sound like the earth splitting open. She threw herself toward the back wall, pulling Rusty with her, as the great pine surrendered. The impact was not a crash. It was a deep, world-ending thump that she felt through the floorboards, through the soles of her feet, through every bone in her body. The entire cabin shuddered sideways an inch and then settled back, groaning. Dust and splinters rained from the ceiling. A single tie in the roof cracked with a sound like a rifle shot, but the roof did not collapse. The pine had struck the cabin, and the cabin had refused to die. For a long moment, Sharon could not move. She lay against the ties, her arms wrapped around the dog, listening to the storm continue to rage outside, but now muffled by the immense weight of the fallen giant lying across her home. She imagined the treetop draped over the walls, the branches thrashing in the wind, the trunk pinning her roof like a hand. But she was still breathing. Rusty was still breathing. That single cracked tie in the ceiling held, the others around it refusing to buckle because the load was distributed, because the walls were monstrously strong, because she had known to make them monstrously strong. She had not known a tree would fall, but she had known the world would try. The storm lasted another 6 hours. Sharon counted time by the stove. She fed it small pieces of split pine, afraid that a larger fire might weaken the already stressed structure. She sat in the dimness, her back against a wall that still smelled faintly of creosote and tar, and she talked to Rusty in a low voice about nothing at all. About Thomas, about the first tie she dragged, about Finn McCready's warning. The dog listened as dogs do, without judgment, and his presence kept her anchored to the present moment. Sometime in the early hours before dawn, the wind began to change. It grew fitful, no longer a single sustained scream but a series of ragged gusts, each one shorter than the last. The pressure in the cabin eased. Then around what must have been sunrise, though no light pierced the cloud, the world went still. Not calm, not quiet, but still. The storm had passed over the ridge and moved on to kill other valleys. Sharon stood slowly, her joints stiff from cold and fear. She lifted the bar from the door and pushed. It refused to open. She put her shoulder to it and shoved harder, and the door scraped open 6 inches against a wall of white. Snow had packed against the cabin on the windward side so deeply that it rose nearly to the low eaves. She dug with her hands, scooping handful after handful of powder until she cleared enough space to squeeze through. Rusty jumped out behind her and immediately sank to his belly in the drift. The world she stepped into was no longer the world she had known. Trees lay everywhere, thrown like matchsticks across the slope. The ponderosa pine, the ancient monarch, lay in two pieces. Its top half had sheared clean off and now rested across her cabin roof, the massive limbs draped over the walls like a blanket of needles. The trunk, 6 feet thick at the break point, had hit the cabin and splintered, but the tie walls had absorbed the energy, transferring the load down into the stone foundation she had dug with bleeding hands. The cracked tie in the roof had been the only casualty. The rest of the structure stood as if nothing had happened. Sharon walked around the cabin once, then twice, touching the ties with bare fingers, checking every joint. The walls were plumb. The roof, though loaded with an impossible weight, had not sagged. In a valley where every other small structure had been flattened or crushed, where the mining office lost its roof, and 3 freight wagons were found overturned a mile from the tracks, this one tiny bunker of discarded railroad refuse stood whole. Finn McCready came walking through the destruction just after 9 o'clock. He had been at the mining office all night, and the look on his face when he crested the ridge above Sharon's claim was something she would remember for the rest of her life. He stopped dead in the snow, his mouth opening and closing without producing words. His eyes went from the fallen pine to the cabin and back again. Then he walked forward slowly as if approaching a holy sight. He placed both hands on one of the outer ties and pushed. The wall did not move. He pushed harder, still nothing. He turned to Sharon, who was standing in the snow with Rusty beside her, her dress torn, her face smudged with creosote and dirt, and he said the only words that made sense. The railroad doesn't know what they threw away. By midday, word had spread. The storekeeper came. Mrs. Harkness, who had once called Sharon possessed, stood at a distance, clutching her shawl. The men from the saloon, the same ones who had watched her drag ties past them without lifting a finger, now stared at the cabin with a kind of reverence that bordered on fear. Nobody had ever seen a building survive what this one had. Nobody could explain it. They touched the ties. They examined the joints. They asked questions Sharon did not feel the need to answer, because the cabin itself was the answer. But it was not the entire story. Because as the community gathered around that strange, scarred bunker, a deeper question began to form in the minds of those who understood business. The railroad had dumped those ties, hundreds of them, thousands maybe. And if they could be transformed into something that outlasted a disaster, then perhaps the widow had accidentally built something more valuable than shelter. She had built proof. And now, the men with the power to profit from that proof would have to decide what they wanted more, to ignore her or to own her. 3 days after the Great Blowdown, a representative of the Western Extension Railroad arrived in Granite Fork. His name was Leland Thorne, and he came not on horseback but in a private car attached to the morning freight, a man who wore a wool suit and carried a ledger before him like a shield. He had heard rumors in the division office, wild stories about a woman who had built a shack from discarded ties that survived a gale which had flattened the company's own freight depot. Such tales were bad for business. They made the railroad look wasteful at best and criminally negligent at worst. Thorne was sent to make the problem disappear. He found the widow's cabin without asking directions, because the whole town was still clustered around it like a pilgrimage site. The tracks of the fallen pine remained where they had crashed, the broken trunk now resting across the roof as if nature itself had conceded defeat. Thorne stood at a distance for a long time, making small marks in his ledger, and then he approached Sharon with a smile that never reached his eyes. He congratulated her on her good fortune. He remarked that the storm must have been terrifying. Then, very gently, he let her know that the materials she had used were, strictly speaking, the property of the railroad, and that removing them without authorization constituted theft. He was prepared to be generous, however. If she would sign a release acknowledging the company's ownership and agree to dismantle the structure, he would recommend against prosecution. She could keep the lumber, strip it down, use it for something smaller. A chicken coop, perhaps. Sharon listened without moving. Rusty pressed against her leg, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The townspeople who had gathered nearby fell silent, watching. Mrs. Harkness clutched her shawl tighter. The storekeeper shuffled his feet. Nobody spoke in her defense. Finn McCready stood off to one side, chewing on a stem of dried grass, his eyes unreadable. Sharon did not argue. She did not cry. She simply said no. The word landed with the flat finality of a spike driven into oak. Then she asked Thorne whether the railroad had ever once complained when those ties were rotting in the mud, whether anyone from the company had bothered to haul them away before she dragged them, one by one, until her hands bled, whether the railroad would now like to explain to the whole valley why it was trying to punish the only structure that had survived a storm the company's own engineers had failed to predict. Thorne's smile tightened. He glanced at the crowd, recalculating. He had been sent to handle a frightened widow, not a public spectacle. He closed his ledger and told her she would hear from the company's legal counsel. Then he walked back toward the depot, his boots slipping on the frozen mud, and a few of the men who had watched her suffer in silence now suddenly found the courage to laugh at his retreat. But Sharon knew the matter was not finished. Men like Leland Thorne did not travel this far into the mountains to lose an argument. 2 weeks later, a second representative arrived. This one was older, leaner, with hands that looked as though they had actually worked on a track gang in some distant youth. His name was Arthur Cole, and he was the regional superintendent, a man who understood not just law but leverage. He did not threaten prosecution. He offered a purchase. The railroad would buy the cabin outright at a fair market rate and use it as a storage shed for tools. Sharon could relocate to a company house in town, rent-free for the first year. The cabin itself would become railroad property, and she would agree never to speak publicly of its origins. Sharon asked him why the company wanted a cabin it had already declared to be stolen goods, why it wanted silence, why it wanted her gone. Cole did not lie. He told her that the story was spreading beyond Granite Fork. Newspapers in Sacramento, and even as far east as Omaha, had printed letters about the Taiwan woman who had outlasted the Great Blizzard. The railroad was now facing awkward questions from shareholders about why it had been discarding perfectly usable timber in a region where settlers were freezing to death in poorly built shacks. The company needed the story to die, and if it could not die, it needed to be controlled. Sharon said she would think about it. That night, she sat alone inside the cabin with Rusty's head on her knee and thought about the life she had been offered. A company house, rent-free silence, a small, safe box in which to disappear. And then she thought about Thomas, who had died for that company in a blast that could have been prevented with better safety fuses. She thought about the 80 ties, each one a testament to something the railroad had thrown away. And by the time the candle burned down to its stub, she knew exactly what she would do. The following morning, she walked into the mining office where Finn McCready was repairing a piece of harness and told him she needed a lawyer, not to defend herself, to draft a proposal. Finn gave her a long look, the kind that had measured 1,000 tree lines and 100 winters. Then he nodded once and gave her the name of a man in the county seat who owed him a favor. What happened next moved faster than anyone in Granite Fork expected. The lawyer wrote a letter to the railroad's main office in San Francisco, not begging for mercy, not pleading poverty, but making a cold business argument. The letter pointed out that the western extension was sitting on tens of thousands of discarded ties along its right-of-way, all of which were slowly rotting into liability. Every winter, settlers lost barns, homes, and lives because they lacked access to heavy timber. The widow's cabin had just demonstrated in the most public possible manner that those ties could be repurposed into structures capable of withstanding the worst weather the Sierras could deliver. Rather than bury the story, the company should embrace it. Sell the ties at a discount to homesteaders. Provide a simple guide to the stacking method. Hire the widow as a paid consultant to demonstrate the technique. Turn an embarrassment into a profit stream while earning the goodwill of every frontier community along the line. Superintendent Cole received the letter on a Tuesday. By Friday, he was back in Granite Fork with a very different kind of offer. The company would not purchase the cabin. It would purchase her knowledge. Sharon would receive a contract to sort, grade, and sell discarded ties to settlers, earning a commission on every sale. She would oversee the training of company agents in the art of tie-wall construction, and the cabin itself would remain her property, a permanent demonstration site that the railroad would arrange for visiting newspapermen to inspect. The woman who had been laughed at as a mad widow would now become the official face of the company's new homestead protection initiative. The town was dumbfounded. Men who had refused to help her drag a single tie now came forward offering labor for the new business, hoping to catch some of the prosperity. Mrs. Harkness, who had whispered about possession, now told the minister that she had always believed in the poor dear's strength of character. The saloon, meanwhile, sprouted a new piece of lore. A round of drinks was named the creosote, strong enough to knock a man flat and leave him standing, just like the widow's walls. But the story did not end with a contract and a handshake, because as word of the deal spread through the valleys, other forces began to stir. Settlers who had lost livestock and barns in the storm wrote to the railroad requesting ties sent to their claims. A lumbermen's association in the northern part of the state complained that the railroad was undercutting the commercial timber market. A territorial politician, seeing opportunity, proposed a bill that would require all public railways to donate waste materials to frontier communities for disaster-resistant housing. The widow's cabin had been a curiosity. Now it was becoming a movement. And standing in the middle of it all, still wearing the same faded prairie dress, her hands still stained with creosote, was Sharon herself. She had not asked for fame. She had not wanted power. But events had placed her at the center of a collision between corporate interest, political ambition, and the desperate needs of ordinary people struggling to survive on the edge of the frontier. The real question was no longer whether she could keep her cabin. It was whether she could keep control of her own life. Finn McCready came to see her one last time before the snow melted fully from the high passes. He found her behind the cabin, splitting kindling, rusty drowsing in a patch of thin sunlight. He stood beside the chopping block and spoke without preamble. "You've got what you wanted," he said. "More'n most ever get, so tell me why you don't look like a woman who's won." Sharon let the axe rest against the stump. She looked toward the cabin, its dark walls still scarred from the storm, the fallen pines still draped across the roof because she had chosen to leave it there as a reminder. "Because I'm afraid," she said. "Not of the company, not of the politicians. I'm afraid that when the next storm comes, and it will, I'll have forgotten how to be the woman who dragged those ties alone. I'll have forgotten what it felt like to need no one's help but the dog." Finn considered this for a long while. Then he reached into his coat and produced a small, weathered notebook, its pages filled with scribbled observations about wind, snow, and timber. He tore out a single page and handed it to her. On it was a crude drawing of a tie wall with arrows showing load paths and a single line written beneath. "The storm builds what you teach it to build." "I never told you this," Finn said, "but I saw what you did that first month. I watched you drag those ties while everyone laughed. I could have helped. I didn't. And the reason I didn't is the same reason you're afraid now. Because when a person survives alone, it changes something inside them, makes it hard to trust what comes next." He folded the notebook shut and met her eyes. "But you're not alone anymore. You just haven't figured out how to stop fighting yet." He turned and walked away down the muddy path, and Sharon watched him go until his shape disappeared behind the ridge. Then she looked at the paper in her hand, then at the cabin, and finally at the dog who had never once left her side. The railroad contract was already signed. The future was already arriving faster than she could control it. But something in Finn's words had planted a seed of doubt inside her mind. Not about her strength, about the price of using it alone. That seed would soon grow into the most difficult decision of her life. Because the railroad's offer, as generous as it appeared, came with strings she had not yet fully understood. And when those strings were pulled, they would threaten to unravel not just her cabin, but the very identity she had built from 80 ties and a grief no one else could carry. The strings began to tighten in the spring of 1880, just as the meltwater started cutting channels through the mud, and the first settlers arrived in Granite Fork asking for ties by name. Leland Thorne had not disappeared after his retreat. He had simply shifted his campaign from the front door to the back office, where contracts were written in ink too small for most eyes to read. The agreement Sharon had signed contained a clause that neither she nor her county lawyer had fully understood. The railroad retained final approval over every sale, every tie, every buyer, Every instruction she gave to a homesteader had to pass through the company's new Homestead Protection Office, which Thorne himself now headed. His first act was to impose a pricing structure so steep that most settlers could not afford the ties without taking on a high-interest loan from the railroad's finance arm. The very people she had hoped to serve were being made into debtors before they hammered their first spike. Sharon received the new rate sheet from a clerk who could not meet her eyes. She read it twice, then a third time while standing in the doorway of her cabin. Rusty nosed at her hand, not understanding, only knowing that the calm was gone. The tie that had cost almost nothing when it lay rotting beside the tracks was now priced higher than fresh-milled timber from the Valley Mill. The widow who had built a fortress from waste was now being used to sell that waste at a profit that would never reach her neighbors. She rode to the depot that afternoon, not on a wagon, but on a mule borrowed from Finn McCready, because she wanted no company favors. She found Thorne in the small office beside the freight platform, his ledger open before him like a scripture. She placed the rate sheet on his desk and asked him to explain why a widow who had lost her husband to a blasted fuse was now being asked to hand over her life's work to the same men who had never paid for his funeral. Thorne did not flinch. He told her that business was business, and that the company had only agreed to pay her a commission, not to give away its assets. If she did not like the terms, she could return to her cabin and remain a curiosity rather than a partner. That word, curiosity, was meant to wound. It landed with the weight of every man who had stood in the mud and watched her drag ties without lifting a hand. But then a strange thing happened. Instead of shame, she felt a clarity she had not known since the morning she decided to drag the first tie. She had never needed their partnership. She had needed only the truth that the ties worked, and that truth was now known far beyond Granite Fork. Thorne had forgotten that the story was no longer his to suppress. It was hers to tell. She walked out of the depot without another word, mounted the mule, and rode not back to her claim, but to the newspaper office in the county seat. The editor, a man named Driscoll who had been one of the first to publish letters about the Tywall woman, listened to her account for nearly an hour. He asked sharp questions. He took notes in a hurried hand. Then he wrote an editorial that ran on the front page the following Thursday, under the headline, "The Widow's Wall and the Railroad That WANTS It Torn Down." The fallout was faster than anyone predicted. Other newspapers picked up the story, not just in California but in Nevada, Oregon, even as far east as Chicago. The image of a lone woman dragging 80 ties while a powerful corporation tried to seize her creation proved irresistible. Letters poured into the railroad's main office, some from shareholders demanding to know why their company was being portrayed as a villain. Within 3 weeks, the board of directors dispatched a vice president named Curtis Hammond to personally review the situation. Thorne was relieved of his position before Hammond's train had even pulled into Granite Fork. Hammond was not a sentimental man. He had risen through the ranks by solving problems, not by taking sides. But he understood what Thorne had not. The railroad was losing more money defending an indefensible position than it would ever gain from inflated tie prices. More importantly, the company's chief engineer had quietly filed a report confirming that the tie wall construction method was structurally superior to any standard snow fence used on the line. The widow's design could be adapted to protect water towers, section houses, even depot platforms from avalanche and drift. If the company did not embrace it, a competitor would. Sharon was summoned to the county seat for a meeting with Hammond. This time she brought Finn McCready, who sat in the corner of the hotel suite and said nothing for the entire 2 hours, but whose presence alone reminded everyone that this woman was not without allies. Hammond offered a new contract, simple and fair. The company would pay Sharon a fixed fee for every tie sold, with no price markups above a reasonable margin. She would train a crew of company carpenters in the construction method, and those carpenters would be dispatched free of charge to any settlement that requested them. Any homesteader who could not afford a tie could apply for a grant from the railroad's newly established Winter Safety Fund, and the cabin in Granite Fork would remain her private property in perpetuity, with a small brass plaque to be mounted by the door, marking it as the birthplace of the method. She signed. Then she asked for one more thing. The pine tree that still lay across her roof, the giant that had crashed down in the storm. She wanted it left exactly where it was, not out of pride, she said, but as proof. Hammond granted the request without argument. Over the next decade, the tie wall method spread across the Western Territories. The railroad shipped bundles of used ties to settlements from the Sierras to the Dakotas, each accompanied by a printed manual that Sharon had written in her own hand, with diagrams traced from Finn McCready's old notebook. Settlers who had once shivered in flimsy shacks now raised walls of creosote-soaked oak, their homes embedded against a wind that had killed so many before them. The company's Winter Safety Fund, the same fund that had seemed like a public relations stunt when first announced, ended up saving more lives during the brutal winter of 1886 than any government program of the era. And the woman who had started it all remained in Granite Fork, living in the cabin beneath the fallen pine, with Rusty growing gray beside her, a quiet authority settling into her bones. But there is a detail that the manuals never included. A small, almost invisible piece of the story that only a few people ever knew. During the winter of 1886, the same winter that killed thousands of cattle across the plains and buried entire towns, a second great storm struck Granite Fork. This one was worse than the first, a true blizzard born in the Gulf of Alaska that screamed down the coast and hit the Sierras with winds measured at over 100 miles per hour. By then the valley had a dozen tie wall cabins, built by families who had learned from Sharon's example. Every single one of those cabins survived. Not a roof was lost, not a wall collapsed. The one building that failed was the old mining office, the same one whose roof had been torn off in the earlier storm. It had been rebuilt with standard timber construction, and the wind peeled it open like a tin can. But the hidden detail was not about the buildings. It was about Sharon herself. That night during the worst hours of the storm, a young mother from one of the new families went into labor. The homestead was 3 miles from town, unreachable through the whiteout. The husband, frantic, did the only thing he could think of. He tied himself to a rope and fought his way through the drifts to the widow's cabin, the one with the plaque, and pounded on the door. Sharon opened it. She pulled him inside, listened to his plea, and then did something that startled even Finn McCready, who had taken shelter with her that night. She gathered her medical kit, the one she had never mentioned to anyone, and said simply, "I was a midwife's daughter before I was a railroad wife." Then she went out into the storm with the man, and together they reached the homestead in time for her to deliver a healthy girl. The baby was named Mara. She was the first child born in a tie wall home, but she would not be the last. And when she grew old enough to ask about the strange dark wood that made up her family's walls, her mother would tell her the story of the widow who had dragged 80 ties alone, who had been mocked and threatened and nearly crushed, and who had refused to become anything other than what she was. "The cabin still stands," the mother would say, "and the woman who built it is still in there, with a dog at her feet and a pine tree on her roof. You can go see for yourself." And many people did. The truth about Sharon's final years is quieter than the legend, but no less significant. She never left Granite Fork. She never remarried. She trained 4 more crews of carpenters, including 3 women who became the first female construction forewomen west of the Rockies, a fact the railroad unhelpfully omitted from its promotional materials. She continued to sell ties until the company switched to concrete sleepers at the turn of the century, at which point she declared herself officially retired and spent her remaining days planting a garden inside the calm basin of her original cabin. When she died in 1906, at the age of 63, the entire valley attended her funeral. The railroad sent a private car. Even Leland Thorne, now retired and living in a boarding house in Sacramento, sent a written condolence that no one read aloud. They buried her on a slope overlooking the cabin, with a headstone made from a single railroad tie that had never been used, its grain still dark with creosote. Carved into the wood were the dates of her life, and beneath them the words that Finn Macready had written on that scrap of paper so many winters before. The storm builds what you teach it to build. Rusty lived 2 more years and died peacefully on the cabin porch, having never once left her side, even in death. The cabin itself remained standing through the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906, through a century of neglect, through the attentions of vandals and relic hunters, and finally into an era when historic preservation societies began to notice what they had almost lost. In 1987, the state declared it a protected landmark. The fallen pine, now a gray skeleton stripped of bark by 100 years of weather, still lies across the roof. Visitors who make the hike up the valley can see it through the windows that have been installed by the conservation team. They can read the plaque, which mentions the railroad's role only in the smallest possible font, and they can stand inside the still, quiet basin of air that Sharon created from 80 discarded ties and a grief that no one else could carry. What the plaque does not say, what no official document ever quite captures, is that the cabin is not just a structure. It is a question. The same question that Parker Vale's rings of cedar posed to every traveler who passed through Cannon Butte Basin. Are you willing to listen to what the storm is trying to teach you? And if you are, will you have the courage to act on what you hear, even when everyone else is laughing? The cabin still stands. In a world that has replaced frontier wagons with highways and railroad empires with stock portfolios, those dark walls of creosote-soaked oak remain upright against the Sierra sky. The fallen pine still lies across the roof, gray and skeletal, a permanent testament to the night when the whole valley learned that strength is not measured by size but by stubbornness. And the plaque beside the door still tells the story in the smallest possible font, careful not to give the railroad too much credit, careful not to romanticize the suffering of a woman who dragged 80 ties alone. But the cabin is not a monument to the past. It is a mirror. Every visitor who steps into that quiet basin of still air, who runs a hand across the joints she packed with clay and gravel, who hears the wind moving around the walls instead of through them, is forced to ask a question that has nothing to do with history. It has everything to do with who they themselves would have been on that long-ago morning when the black clouds gathered over the ridge. Would you have helped her? Or would you have stood with the others outside the general store, shaking your head at the mad widow, certain that grief had finally broken her mind? Would you have understood that the ties she dragged were not just timber but a declaration? That every gouge in the frozen mud was a line drawn between herself and a world that expected her to quietly disappear? The uncomfortable truth is that most of us cannot honestly answer those questions. We want to believe we would be the exception, the one brave soul who steps forward when everyone else stands frozen. But the record of human behavior in every crisis suggests otherwise. Most people watched. Most people laughed. Most people waited to see if she would fail before deciding whether her effort had been worth respecting. That is not cruelty, or at least not only cruelty. It is the ordinary cowardice of living inside a crowd that has not yet made up its mind. Sharon's genius was not structural. It was existential. She understood something that most frontier settlers never allowed themselves to believe, that nature is not an enemy to be defeated but a force to be read. The wind did not hate her. The snow had no malice. The pine tree that crashed onto her roof was not trying to kill her. These were simply forces moving according to patterns older than any human settlement, and if she could learn those patterns, she could survive them. The tie walls were not armor against the world. They were a lesson the world had been trying to teach for millennia, written in a language most people refused to learn. And here is the part that should keep you awake tonight. The railroad had those ties sitting in piles beside the tracks for years. Any man in Granite Fork could have hauled them home. Any family could have built a shelter that would outlast a blizzard. They did not lack the materials. They lacked the imagination, and they lacked the faith that a woman with bleeding hands and a stray dog could possibly know something they did not. So the question that haunts this story, the question that haunts every story of unlikely survival, is not whether Sharon was exceptional. It is whether the rest of us are willing to admit how ordinary our own inaction really is. How many storms have we weathered by sheer luck and then called it wisdom? How many discarded resources have we walked past because we could not see what a grieving widow saw? How many times have we mistaken the courage of others for foolishness, simply because we were too afraid to carry a weight that heavy ourselves? Sharon did not defeat the storm. She taught the storm to build a shelter around her. That is not the same thing as victory. It is something rarer. It is partnership. It is listening. It is the terrifying humility of admitting that the wind is older than you, smarter than you, and willing to work with you only if you stop trying to punch it in the face. If you ever find yourself standing in Granite Fork, the cabin is easy to locate. Follow the old wagon path past the mining office, keep the ridge on your left, and walk until you see the fallen pine. The door is always open. The air inside is always still. And if you stand there long enough, you might begin to feel what Sharon felt on the night of the great storm, that the world outside is loud and violent and indifferent, but that inside these walls, something has been rearranged. The chaos has been broken apart. The wind has been filtered into silence. So I will ask you the same question that I asked at the beginning of this story. Not whether Sharon was a genius, not whether the railroad deserved its redemption, not whether the townsfolk ever truly repented for their neglect. Those answers are already written in the timber. The question that remains is this: what are you walking past right now that someone else will one day turn into a fortress? And when the storm comes for you, will you have anything stronger than laughter to hold against it? Subscribe to witness more stories where ordinary people face impossible odds and discover that the thing they needed most was the thing everyone else threw away.